I've been basically into game development, history first. So that's just some images of games I've worked on in the past decade that I've been doing game development. Went to QUT, studied software engineering because I figured, I have to be able to program to make games. Lucky guess. And then I started a company with 2 other people called Blokes Studios in Brisbane, and we started making a game. Shortly after that, one of the founders left, and we made, I'm going to try and use this pointer thing. Oh, look at that. That's amazing. That's the first game that we made over there. It was called Magical Forest. It was for casual games sort of downloadable market. There's these websites like iWin or Big Fish Games, or I'm not sure which ones are still around these days, but you'd sort of download a game, play it for 60 minutes or however long, and then you'd choose whether you want to buy it or not. So it was kind of like a shareware full purchase model. And we got this game published by iWin, and off the back of that, we actually landed a bunch of contract work from the same company on a hidden object match 3 game, which is Jewel Quest Mysteries. I think it was, Trail of the Midnight Heart and Curse of the Emerald Tear. I think those are the names. And it was actually really good to work on those because it was working with a US company, so it was our second project. It was really good to get that kind of exposure to work with a US company and learn from the people that we got to work with. And it was nice to get paid, of course. you need money to keep the doors open. Soon after that, we spoke to John Passfield, who's been around in the Australian scene for a very long time, and we convinced him to join Blokes, which was amazing. And we turned our attention to Facebook games. We know how that ended up, but look, it was a good idea at the time, we think. So we had a game called Hospital Town, and what was really amazing, like for me personally, on that project was learning how to not just code for server infrastructure for games, but also how to scale to a lot of people. This was back in the day when Facebook still had those notifications. So if you sent a notification with an app, it would immediately go to all those people. There was no limit. There was no kind of filtering. So we went from a couple hundred users to 1,000 users to 150,000 users over the span of a month. And I was panicking and figuring out what a load balancer is and how to add webheads and shard databases and all that stuff. It was pretty intense, but it was a great learning experience. And it did make it easier to follow up with other projects. We had kind of a I'm going to say a failed project because we released it and it was buggy, and the person that that was funding it cancelled the funding. But we did actually do a Virtual Villages Facebook game. If anyone's ever played that, it's like sort of a Tamagotchi but with people on a tribal island. After that, we did some spaceship games on Facebook, and off a game called Galactic Trader, we actually managed to sell our company, which was amazing because we were running out of money. Startups. So, so once we sold the company, then we sold it to a US company called RockU, and they were I think they're now an ad company, but at the time they're also doing games publishing and game development on Facebook. And having sold our company off a space game, of course you have to follow up with another freaking space game. And then after about a year, which is a very long time in Facebook gaming space, they were having issues and they had to chop a whole bunch of studios, and we were one of the studios they had to chop. And we ended up going over to another US company and saying, hey, you wanna start a studio in Brisbane? And that turned into Kixeye Brisbane, or Kixeye Australia, sorry. So that was really good because actually one of the worst things about running out of money in startups is you have to let people go, and if you've ever had to do that, you know it's a horrible feeling. It's probably one of the worst things you'll ever have to do. So it was really, really good that we could get everyone a job and kind of grow another studio in Brisbane. And we started working on another space game called Vega Conflict. And I left after about 8 months to a year after things looked stable, because I'm like, okay, I've had enough of space games, I've had enough of Facebook gaming, I'm going to go back and do indie game development. And I did. Worked on Me Munchy, which was a iOS and Android game that was released a few years ago now, and most recently worked on Ninja Pizza Girl, about finished up about a year ago, and I started working at Defiant, working on Hand of Fate 2. So that's kind of a brief history of my sort of game career life so far. But I figured, you know, I wanted to talk about gameplay programming. It's something that I find very interesting. It's probably the sort of role that I most identify with. If I have to pick one role, it'd be gameplay programming. And what I thought I'd do is just talk about my experiences, thoughts and opinions, kind of broke it up into what I think gameplay programming actually means. And I'll delve a little bit into each of the parts that I think make it up, and I also have some links to some resources for game design and programming and Unity development specifically and whatnot. It might be stuff you've already seen already. So essentially, what I mean when I say gameplay programming, I mean the stuff that sits between the code and all that other junk. You know, game design, art, audio, writing, etc. And really it's the combination of all those disciplines coming together that creates the user experience, which is ultimately what you're trying to do when you're making a game. I think a great gameplay programmer has a really solid coding foundation. You have to have at least a basic understanding of the other disciplines. It really helps to know sort of why you're coding what you're coding. And you absolutely have to be a strong team player. The easier it is to work with you, the better result you'll be able to get. Coding muscles. So how many of you are programmers or have done a bit of programming? Almost everyone. Excellent. So you've probably already come across this already, but essentially, my opinion, you're combining two things. You're combining problem solving and your ability to speak or write the language that you're coding in. And the better that you can speak that language, the more you understand it, the more problem solving patterns and skills and tools you have, the stronger you'll be in programming. In terms of getting better at problem solving, unfortunately, there is no, as I'm sure you know if you've been programming, there is no quick fix, no magic bullet to get faster and better. You just have to practice a lot and just keep at it. There are things you can do to kind of not hinder your learning, is the way that I'd like to think about it, which is seeking out how others have solved the problem. You know, thank you, Stack Overflow. But when you do go to seek out those resources, try to understand sort of the type of solution that they used, rather than just copying and pasting the code. That way you can add it to your toolbox of ways that you can solve problems. The second point, I think, is focusing on the problem goals. So trying not to over-engineer something. If you have to make, I don't know, an enemy shoot a projectile, then start with that before you write a whole combat system around it, because you may actually not need to end up writing that depending on what happens with the game design. And yeah, just definitely just keep on expanding your knowledge and in terms of how you can solve problems and how others solve problems. And you want to constantly be trying to expand your skill set in terms of how, you know, different ways of solving problems, because sometimes the way that you've solved it so far isn't appropriate anymore and you need to use a different way. So this is just very basic stuff. If you've all programmed before, it's very important to understand the basics. It's easy to overlook some basic parts of the language. So you want to make sure that you're on top of all of those. It's actually really useful to do case studies as well, specifically for gameplay programming. So you can look at something in another game and go, oh, okay, there's this one sort of bit of functionality. I wonder how they did that, and then you can try to replicate it and try to see it, and then you'll run into sort of similar problems that potentially those people came across when they were implementing it, and you get to learn from that, and it might also answer a few of those questions where you're like, oh, it's so weird how they did it like that. I wonder why they did it like that, and then you go, oh, okay, now I know. It's because of those issues that you encounter. There's also so many videos and blogs out there to look at. Cool 18 Creates is a good introductory one for Unity. Making stuff look good is really, really good for shaded case studies for Unity 3D. Thanks, Chris. And you know, there's just so much. I didn't want to list them all. There's so much stuff out there that you can actually seek it out from people at Unity as well. That you can really learn a lot if you go out and look for it. So in terms of gameplay stuff, the sort of roles is kind of systems architecture, user interface, gameplay, network multiplayer, graphics tools, etc., etc., etc. There's many sort of specializations. The split and mix depends on sort of what kind of game you're trying to make for what market. Like, you know, if you're trying to target Steam, you know, let's say you're making a roguelike shooter game for Steam, you know, that has different goals than making a mobile game that has to be viral and has to spread by itself. As in, there's no marketing. There's not as much marketing. There's not as much sort of support from the store to showcase your game. You have to virally go out through friends and say, you know, send your friend a life, or let your friend draw a picture, and then you have to guess what it is. If you remember that app, that went really well. That came. I forget what it's called. Draw something. Yes, that went really amazing. And while it is important to sort of course, focus on gameplay programming, if you want to be a gameplay programmer, it is very useful to know how to architect something, how to build systems around things. Graphics especially is very useful to know how to make things look really good and optimize things so they can run on the device that you're trying to go for, if it's on a device or for PCs. Some of my tips for gameplay programming is make sure you're always working towards an end product. Sorry, I know it's a wall of text, everyone. It's kind of the why of what you're doing. You know, why are you writing this system? Why are you writing this feature? There's always a goal in mind to achieve with gameplay programming. Make decisions, and this is one that's easy to get stuck on, and just you know, there's this way of solving the problem. There's that way. There's a third way. There's a fourth way. Just pick one and move on with your life. It really doesn't matter, and over time, you probably will be able to make those decisions a bit smarter, so that you don't have to come back as much and change the architecture of the system that you've chosen. Coming back to it, but you will spend. But it's important not to waste time kind of sitting there deliberating which way you want to solve it. Just pick a way and go for it. Also, walk before you run. And I guess this is kind of touching on the previous point as well. This is more to do with game design and answering design questions. You want to make sure that you've prototyped functionality and proven that it needs to be there before you build a system around it. Otherwise, you could spend, I don't know, for example, 1 or 2 weeks building a system, and then game designer plays it and goes, oh yeah, no, this is a bad idea. Let's not do that. Then code goes in the bin. So it's better if that's 1 or 2 days rather than 1 or 2 weeks. And of course, once it has been proven, you don't want to leave behind a mess. You want to go back, clean it up, make a nice system if you're going to be making lots of things. For example, let's say you're making a combat game and there's enemies. You've prototyped 3 enemies, and then you've kind of gotten an idea of the basic things that are required. Then you might make some nice systems for spawning the enemies and the projectiles that they shoot and the effects that they have. And then you want to add more and more enemies and go, okay, let's add that 4th enemy that fills this role. Let's add that 5th enemy that fills that role, and kind of just let the gameplay sort of guide how you build the systems out. And you essentially just don't want to waste time building things to get thrown away because they weren't good. They weren't fulfilling the game design purpose that they were meant to be fulfilling. And of course, stay positive and be open to change. Things change, and that's life. You just got to move on. So I've covered some coding stuff. I might actually just ask if anyone has any questions about the walls of text I just went through with coding before I go to the next part. No? Okay, good. So understanding other disciplines. The why of gameplay programming really, it starts to be answered when you start looking at other disciplines. So in a very basic form, a game is the user inputs some stuff happens on the screen and the speakers, rinse and repeat, that's it. That's a game loop. Well, that's an interaction loop. And specifically what that stuff depends on the creative direction of the game you're making. So if you're making a roguelike shooter for Steam, then the interaction is you shooting things when you press the mouse button, dodging projectiles when you press the dodge button, walking around the terrain, and so on and so forth. And the creative direction is of course set by the creative director. It's a very fitting name. Let's talk a little bit about game design. Game design. So for a gameplay programmer, I think this is the most important other discipline other than programming for you to know. Trying to realize the creative vision and drive things forward in that direction is your primary goal. Art and audio is as well extremely important, but ultimately the user experience is not something that happens on the screen or out of a speaker. It's something that happens inside a person's head. So it's a bit abstract. So if you pick up and play something, it might look beautiful and it might sound beautiful, but it might feel absolutely awful to play. That's a bad game. It has to feel good as well. So as a rough guideline, I think the sort of basic minimum is you should have some sort of understanding of game design. There's a great book called The Art of Game Design, A Book of Lenses by Jesse Schell. It's a long book, but it does sort of go through each of the bits and what each of the components are and how they make up the user experience and whatnot. I found it really useful myself. You want to make sure that going to game design, early in a project, you're trying to answer as many design questions as you can, and especially the really risky ones, the ones that could absolutely tank your game. Is combat an enjoyable thing to do? Did we make the combat work? You want to make sure you answer that early for a combat game. For exploration game, you want to make sure you answer that exploration question. So as a gameplay programmer, you want to make sure that you're prototyping things to help answer those questions. If you need to write some throwaway code just to see if something works, then that's what you do and answer that question, and then you can build systems later on. You're also responsible for iterating with game designers and pushing features and functionality forward. Now what that means is usually there's a request that comes through and it's like, okay, we need let's say some user interface that serves this purpose. It shows your health and the damage you do and whatnot, and you put it in the game, and sometimes the way that it was envisioned that it would work actually is quite painful to do, or would take quite a long time. So then your responsibility is to communicate that back to the designer and go, hey, this is going to take this long. I could do it this other simpler way that would take a fifth of the time, and then you may choose to go with that option and then save a bunch of time. Because it may be that thing was risky anyway and it was going to be cut if it didn't work. So, you know, you don't want to spend 2 weeks and then find that out. Yes, I've already covered the next point. And your final sort of responsibility is to fix bugs and optimize. Now, the reason is a bug can completely destroy an experience. Something unexpected happens, or something doesn't work as it's supposed to, or something breaks, and it just takes the player out of the experience. And it doesn't matter how good your game is, if something explodes, you might as well not have that functionality there. So it's your responsibility to make sure that those bugs are not there. And optimization, of course, making the thing actually run on the device at the frame rate that it's supposed to run. Art direction. So brief. I'll just cover art very briefly. I apologize to the artists in the audience, but it's sort of the visual side of these other disciplines, and it does tie very heavily into game design. And you know, it's very simple responsibilities. You assist in exploring the art direction. You see what's possible. See what you can do, how much stuff you can have on the screen, how pretty it can be, what resolution it can be, etc., etc. And you iterate with artists and optimize and so on and so forth. Under art direction, I would also put, I mean, I'm sort of skipping over art as a whole thing because there's a lot of different disciplines in there. But for example, animation is one of the disciplines that is very important for a combat game that runs on animations. If those animations aren't good, the combat game will not be good. The quality of those animations really does drive the quality of that combat experience in the end. And also, and then flipping back to game design, it also has to be, you know, responsive, because again, you don't want it to feel bad that something good is happening on screen, but you're trying to input something and it doesn't work. And audio, the often forgotten lonely cousin of art, which is, you know, it should tie into the game design and support the art and really work to push the game together. As a bare minimum, you know, you'd be providing functionality and systems for audio engineers so they can attach sound events to triggers that you're sending off. So, you know, bullet fire off this unit, shooting this type of weapon, and then also providing a way to sort of filter that and prioritize that. If there's a lot of stuff going on, the audio engineer will want to be able to balance what's happening. You don't want 5 bullet sounds playing on top of each other, because it would just be one sound playing at 5 times the volume, which is horrible. And again, you have to assist with optimization about cutting those sounds back and getting the performance into spec. And it is very easy, and it often does happen that audio is not treated with respect, and it's either annoying for the user. You get some. The way I'd put it is you get fatigued, like you get tired from listening to the audio, so you turn off the volume, or it just breaks you from the experience. Like you see something and you walk up to it, and you press a button, and then a sound plays, and you're like, "What was that? I was not expecting that sound to play. That didn't match the visuals whatsoever." So I've kind of briefly covered other disciplines. I've kind of flown over it. Does anyone have any quick questions about stuff I've talked about with that?
Have you ever prototyped something that seems a wonderful idea, but when you build the full system, you get a 2-frame result because of all the overheads of the full richness of it? Have you ever
it can
yourself into a corner because of that?
it can happen. It can happen. Generally, what you'd want to do is some investigation up front on talking on a project scope. You want to know how many things you can draw on screen at what resolution, and you know, when shaders start getting involved, it does get more complex. but you can do some investigation ahead of time and kind of roughly figure out a budget for the amount of polygons that you can have on screen and the amount of textures and RAM and whatnot. Yes, it has happened. But ideally, it does not happen. And it also happens less and less. It depends on the team, I guess. If you're in a small team, computers are really, really powerful these days. And it's still easy to destroy them, but there's not as much pressure to kind of keep things optimized as there used to be, or as there would be for a really big game team, like of hundreds of thousands of people. That would be crazy. You'd have to definitely figure out what your budget was for each aspect of the game and stick to it. Otherwise, you'd end up not getting the frame rate that you're going for. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yes.
Do you have any thoughts or comments about gameplay programming for DLC? Maybe.
Yeah.
Because it's like so easy to get that stuff wrong.
Yes. Yes. I think in terms of DLC, it has the most impact on the design side of things. Like, if you've built, if you've game designed a game that can have more content sort of added to it, then it's not as difficult to add DLC things. If you've made something like, I don't know, let's say Uncharted 4 or something that is, or any game that is sort of more of a story experience, it's hard to chop and like insert other things, and especially if you've played past that bit and you're like, oh, hang on, but I can buy DLC for the third chapter or something, then it becomes more painful. In terms of the programming side of it, as long as you've built systems to make lots of content from small bits of functionality, then I think it's not too bad. So I'll now briefly talk about the teamwork part of gameplay programming. It's just one page. I know it's a lot of text, but it's just one page. I guess this is one thing. It's not specifically just gameplay programming. I think for gameplay programming, or even game design, it would, any sort of role where you have to interact with multiple people on the team, you want to make sure that you have really good teamwork skills and really good people skills, and you want to make sure you're developing those skills as well. Game development is definitely a team sport. Once you go past a one person development team, you have to deal with another human being and actually get things done. You have to collaborate, trust, and compromise with the people that you work with. A team is most effective when, one, it's focused on a goal or a set of goals, and two, every person can contribute their best work to the project. If you start getting to the point where people's concerns aren't listened to and they're not able to put forward their best work, where their ideas of how they can best contribute to the project aren't listened to, and that's not realized, then you end up with an inferior product than you would otherwise. And of course, when you're easy and enjoyable to work with, you end up with a much better result. There's a lot less friction, and you focus on the work and you get things done. It also results in a higher quality of work life, which, at some point that becomes more and more important, where you care about your day-to-day quality of life. And the other thing is relationships, and professional relationships and personal relationships. It makes it easier to find a job in the future if you're easy to work with. If you get along with the people that you work with, in 2 years' time, it might not be that different. In 5 years' time, it'll be different. In 10 years' time, who knows where those people will end up. Maybe they'll end up at, Blizzard. And yes, I know someone that's ended up at Blizzard from many years ago, and people that have ended up at Google and wherever. So it is important to kind of foster those professional relationships, which I'm sure you get told if you've been to the startup stuff. It's very important. Now, this is a basic one that I think it mostly happens in game development, or it happens quite a bit in game development, where it shouldn't have to be said, but it does have to be said, where you should treat your team members with respect and listen to what they have to say. You can absolutely learn so much from each other because everyone has a different set of skills. There's so many disciplines involved. There's always an opportunity to learn something you didn't know before you started working on the project. I've worked at some places where it's not a lot of people, but too many people just are really brash or obnoxious, and they don't want to listen to anyone else, and they just do their own thing. It's worse when it's someone in a position of power, of course, because then multiple people suffer. And of course, communication is a really, really valuable skill, and it's worth investing your time and energy on. And it's something that it's not something that I focused on first starting as a programmer. I thought I'll focus on the code and getting my tasks done and whatever. And the more and more it became apparent to me that communication is a skill that is really important, and I have to keep developing my communication skills and be able to collaborate better with people. And just quickly on the trust thing, that has to run both ways. Where if you go out on a limb and you spend a bunch of work trying to help answer some questions from a programming point of view, when you come back and say, hey, there's all these different ways of executing this task, and this way is a lot easier, then you expect a bit of trust to run back as well, and be able to make some shortcuts where you can and save the team a bunch of work. And that's actually the whole talk. I've put some sort of resources up. C# basics. I mean, if you're all programmers already, but I to look at it after learning C#, after already knowing it and going, oh yeah, there's some stuff there I didn't know. And of course, Unity 3D links. A really great book, actually. I was put onto two really great books. I was put onto them by George Fidler. I had the privilege of working with George Fidler, who had many different positions. He was at EA for a very long time as the general manager of I think it was at, I keep forgetting what it's called. It's like Australia. It's like Australia and Asia. He was on the publisher side of things, and I got to work with him at Three Blokes, and he actually helped a lot in us figuring out what our business is and how and where we wanted to go, and selling it to RockU and starting Kixeye Australia. So he put me onto Lateral Thinking and Six Thinking Hats by Edward de Bono, and as someone really analytical and as a programmer, lateral thinking was really useful for me to think a little bit differently than I'm used to thinking, not just go bam, 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 and just allow myself to kind of think a bit differently. And the Six Thinking Hats is really useful for meetings, it helps speed things up where you kind of cover, I don't want to butcher it, it's a good book, but it helps you cover the positives and negatives and all different aspects of an idea so you can consider an idea together, so you're not butting heads as much, you're working together rather than working against each other. Yeah. And of course, there's a bunch of other resources. For a really good writing one that I've just gotten onto is Story Structure 101, super basic stuff. By Dan Harmon. He works on Community, if you've seen that show, and a bunch of others I can't remember. Rick and Morty, yep. So there's a lot of amazing stuff out there by a lot of talented people.
Does anyone have any questions? Actually, can I add a book to that? The Pragmatic Programmer. Have you read that one?
I have not, but I probably should.
Yeah, it's a really good one for principles and that's for programmers to sort of live by and that sort of stuff. Great book as well. I think you find it like based on every top 10 programmer books charts you see out there, so definitely worth a look. But thank you, Marko.
Yeah.
Everybody.